Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to try my best to rank the 6 tank classes in raids and mythic dungeons in early BFA based on a few key metrics. Before we get to how I'll do that exactly, here's a few important disclaimers. First off, I do not know the future. BFA is technically still in the beta, and Blizzard has made major tank balance changes in the first months of expansions before. They nerfed Ignore Pain massively for protection warriors very early on in Legion, just as the most recent example. I could declare Brewmasters the best tank, and Blizzard could decide they agree, and immediately nerf Stagger by 50%, and boom, now they're the worst. This is based on my opinions, while I'm doing my best to be impartial and compare classes based on numbers like armor values, active mitigation, uptimes, and so on. A lot of this does boil down to questions like, which is better, Death Strike or Shield Block? There's not a clear mathematical answer to that question, and even if there was, without the larger tanking context, it wouldn't really mean anything. On top of that, the answer might change depending on what you're tanking or who's healing you. Also, I am doing this for fun. If you disagree, that's okay. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're wrong. Maybe we're both wrong. The important thing is that we're looking at tanks, we like tanking, and we want it to be fun and rewarding, no matter what classes we're playing. The 5 metrics I'll compare tanks on are active mitigation, self-healing, defensive cooldowns, mobility, and utility. So let's start with active mitigation. In terms of ranking the tanks, being able to maintain 100% uptime on an active mitigation skill is a major advantage. It doesn't mean you're always better off. There are situations such as taunt swap boss fights and raids where a tank with less than 100% uptime on their AM can work out better, but in Mythic Plus it's almost always better to have 100% uptime. To that end, Druids are the best tank by far in this category, because they can easily have 100% uptime on a very powerful source of armor and can potentially stack it up to mitigate burst damage. They are number 1. Brewmasters are probably the toughest class to place in this list. They could range anywhere from 2nd place to dead last, but because their active mitigation is extremely reliable and scales up extremely well with enormous amounts of damage from boss abilities, I think they're the 2nd place class on active mitigation overall. Now this may be a little shocking, but I'm giving Protection Warrior the 3rd spot primarily because they get the best of both worlds. They have a moderate strength to armor conversion that's literally got 100% uptime because it's a passive, and they have an extremely strong active mitigation skill on a much lower uptime. This gives them the ability to bank up shield blocks for tank swaps and raids, without having to be super underwhelming and terrible when shield block is down and they're constantly tanking mobs in Mythic Plus. Now that top 3 is what I would consider the top 3 regardless of whether we're talking raid bosses or Mythic dungeons, and here's where it diverges. Death Knight has 100% uptime on Marrow Rend, which is really great in Mythic dungeons. In raids, that 40% strength to armor conversion isn't really great at all when you compare it to the 150% from Shield of the Righteous, or even the 85% you get with Demon Spikes. Now the power of Death Strike will keep you alive-ish, but ultimately, Death Knights are going to remain pretty bad at sheer damage mitigation. By comparison, Paladin and Demon Hunter AMs are really nice in terms of mitigation, and Paladin is the better of the two by far. Alright, let's move on to self-healing, and before I just jump directly to Death Knight, there's really 2 values for self-healing. Effective emergency self-healing, where you can cover up a mistake by your healer or by yourself and keep yourself alive in a pinch, or constant major self-healing that allows you to take pressure off of your healers all the time and lets them focus on other things such as positioning, keeping other group members up, or even trying to squeeze out some damage. Death Knight has all of that. They have everything you could want as a tank when it comes to self-healing. They're number 1 and it's not close. Demon Hunters are, and not really that close, 2nd. The change to Lesser Soul Fragments healing for 8% of damage taken over the last 5 seconds is cool, but because of the way that their rotation works, Demon Hunters aren't really going to time their Spirit Bombs like Death Strikes. Their self-healing will scale up in proportion to damage taken a little bit, and that's good, but it's not really on the level of DK either. Now here's where things get a little more tricky. None of the remaining 4 tanks have great consistent self-healing tools like DK or DH at all. Paladin comes in 3rd because unlike the others, it at least has a powerful emergency self-healing tool on a reasonably short cooldown. Light of the Protector is on the global cooldown, which makes it both a defensive and offensive sacrifice to cast, and it really doesn't feel good, but it is there if you need a heal to save your life. Lay on Hands is also a powerful heal for what it's worth. It's more of a cooldown really, but it is technically a full health self-heal. Kind of like with active mitigation, Brewmaster monks could go anywhere from 2nd place to last place. On their own, Brewmasters are bad at self-healing. Guard is a nice self-absorb, but aside from that, monks have limited, unreliable self-healing toolkits that are based entirely on getting beaten up by enemies so that you can create self-healing orbs. However, with healers doing way more healing than tanks, Celestial Fortune basically turns them into insane healing machines the moment they look at a Brewmaster. As a result, monks should fall into a weird space where they'll probably be extremely high on tank healing meters in BFA despite doing very little actual self-healing themselves. Druids and warriors are just about even, and that they're both extremely bad at self-healing. Druid has an emergency self-heal that provides 24% of your health over 3 seconds. It's a hot, so it's not exactly a great emergency heal, but it is quick enough and it at least ticks for 6% of your health instantly. It's also on the global cooldown, which is lame. Warriors beneath Druid do to ignore pain, only absorbing 50% of the damage shielded, which makes it a terrible emergency heal. Because it's on the GCD, it will also be pretty lame to use, but it can be used fairly often to provide a modest amount of self-shielding, or to prevent predictable burst damage like a sort of tiny defensive cooldown. Right, recapping quickly, this is the ranking for self-healing. It is basically the same in raids and Mythic dungeons, although it will matter a lot more in Mythic dungeons than it will in raids. Defensive cooldowns are up next, so let's just start right off the bat with warriors. They've got your Demo Shout, Shield Wall, Last Stand, and Bolster, Rallying Cry, Spell Reflection, and they've even got Avatar and Booming Voice. And on top of all of that, they have Anger Management. Prout Warriors are the cooldown class. No one else is close. Paladins are the clear 2nd place finisher here. They have Guardian of Ancient Kings, Ardent Defender, and Lay on Hands. They also have Avenging Wrath, Divine Shield, Blessing of Protection, and Blessing of Sacrifice, and while some of that starts to stray into utility territory, they have by far the most versatile collection of cooldowns of any tank, even including Warrior. Death Knight has a group of defensive cooldowns that, like Warrior, is simple and effective and just focuses on keeping you alive. The ability to ignore mechanics through AMS can be a pretty serious advantage on occasion. Druid brings up the lead of the 2nd class citizens. Survival Instincts is unique in that it has 2 charges on the most powerful defensive cooldown. While that is really good, ultimately the class only has that and Bark Skin. Demon Hunters, like Druids, only have 2 defensive cooldown keybinds. Unfortunately, Demon Hunter is in an even worse position in terms of the effectiveness of their cooldowns. Fiery Brand is a strong damage reduction cooldown, but it's a single target skill, and it is now on the GCD and BFA. Yikes. Metamorphosis is a really powerful defensive cooldown, providing resource generation, armor, and additional health, but it's just the one cooldown. You use it, you're basically unkillable for 15 seconds, and then you have Fiery Brand to keep you company for the next 3 minutes. In last place, who else? Brewmasters. Now you could argue that Stagger is the ultimate defensive cooldown, and Brewmasters don't even need real defensive cooldowns. Why, you might even be the developer who created Brewmaster with that attitude, and you're not wrong. That being said, Brewmasters have a grand total of 1 base cooldown and 1 talented cooldown. Maybe 2 if you're counting Guard. I know you're thinking, wait, Llarold, didn't you forget about Zen Meditation? No. I ignored Zen Meditation, because it's not good. At all. Moving on. This is another category where the balance between raids and Mythic dungeons is mostly the same. There will be specific ability timings in Mythic raid progression that probably won't compare with pushing high-level Mythic dungeons. But for the most part, just simply having more cooldowns available more often is going to be better in either scenario. With that in mind, Warrior, Pally, and DK will lead the pack. Brewmaster is in the back. Alright, on to mobility. Mobility, like utility, is kind of difficult to put a numerical value on. As a result, mobility and utility are less important factors when comparing tanks than the 3 metrics we've already looked at. Sometimes a mobility skill can completely trivialize a raid mechanic and make something extremely difficult pretty easy, or allow you to get another 5 seconds of DPS every time a mechanic goes out when compared to a slower class. Then there are times where you're just standing still smashing a boss in the teeth over and over and your mobility skills don't do anything the entire fight. Anyways, here's the mobility ranking by class and some thoughts. Monk is the best. That's it. Warrior's ahead of Demon Hunter because Demon Hunter needs to use Infernal Leap as part of their rotation, and while it is a great mobility skill on its own, having to sacrifice DPS to move quickly or having to walk for a while so you don't lose DPS is not a great trade-off. Druid has gained a lot of personal mobility in BFA, which is great, although it did come at the expense of losing some group mobility, which is kind of a bummer. DK has access to what are probably the two worst mobility skills in the game right now, but 2 is larger than 1, so it's a huge upgrade from Legion and puts them a little bit ahead of Paladin. And Paladin is slow. Alright, on to utility, which is another section that's less critical than active mitigation, self-healing, and defensive cooldowns for the most part. Unlike mobility, utility can have wildly different values in raid and mythic dungeons, and there are some buffs that come from Warrior, Monk, and Demon Hunter that radically increase group DPS. For raids, I'll assume that you're getting those from another member of the group. If you are missing any of them, then they would be more important than almost anything else a tank could bring to the raid. For Mythic Dungeons, I'll just assume the rest of the group is all shamans or something. Alright, now let's start where this should start. DKs still have Death Grip and Gorfiend's Grasp, which pretty much still makes them the best tanks in Mythic Dungeons. Gorfiend's Grasp was nerfed in BFA, its radius was reduced by 5 yards, which is a pretty big nerf. Doesn't matter, still great. DK also has combat reses, which are really nice to have from any member of the group in dungeons. In terms of raiding, DK really doesn't bring much to the table. Death Grip and Gorfiend's Grasp can be more or less mandatory for the occasional ad fight, but that's usually the extent of it. Paladin has by far the deepest and most versatile bag of utility skills of any tank. Blessings of Protection, Sacrifice, Spell Warding, Freedom, even Lay on Hands in a pinch. Their utility skills aren't always useful, but when they are, they can really make fights easier. Warriors got Rally and Cry back, which means they have a raid cooldown. They also bring a 10% attack power buff, which is a huge DPS increase for your physical damage dealers. They have a nice collection of stuns and CC skills for shutting down ads in Mythic Dungeons as well. Just like Monk and Demon Hunter, having a warrior of some kind is pretty close to mandatory in raids, but DPS warriors are easy to find because they're awesome. Monk and Demon Hunter have gained 5% damage debuffs. They're simple and boring, but 5% more damage is a great thing literally all the time. Frankly, having both buffs is pretty much mandatory in raids, and there are certainly guilds that will force their tank into playing one or the other class because they don't have a reliable Windwalker or Havoc Demon Hunter. As for everything else, both classes have a little CC that can be useful in Mythic Dungeons, but they're kinda low on real utility. Monk has AoE stuns. Demon Hunter has AoE silences and fears. Monk gets the slight edge because the move speed increase from Provoke can be insanely powerful for quickly repositioning bosses and enemies, but it's pretty rare that that really comes into play in a huge way. Druids pretty much have Combat Res and Stampeding Roar, and while having Stampeding Roar was a humongous deal in Legion, the removal of Guttural Roars has more or less neutralized that. In the situations where the damage buffs are already covered, the Combat Res and Stampeding Roar and the row of crowd control talents works out to Druids probably being a little bit better than Monk and Demon Hunter, but not by much. So now onto the big finale, ranking the tanks. I'll start with Mythic Dungeons since I've already kinda tipped my hand there a little bit. Blood DKs are number 1. Until Blizzard gives another class a utility skill as crucial to dungeon performance as Death Grip, Blood DKs are going to reign supreme, and it's pretty much that simple. The self-healing goes a really long way too. Protection Paladin was number 2 during Legion in terms of pushing high-level Mythic Dungeons, and I think that will remain the same in BFA. They have such a versatile toolkit that really shines in small group content like Dungeons. You combine self-healing, interrupts on top of interrupts, multiple forms of crowd control, good offensive cooldowns, good defensive cooldowns, and the ability to throw blessings onto party members, and Paladins are looking real nice. Also, the crappy mobility that Pally and DK suffer from usually isn't as big of an issue in dungeons as it is in raids. In third place, it's Demon Hunters. They were good Mythic Plus tanks in Legion because of their great AoE DPS tools and their self-healing. Not only do they still have that, They also bring 5% more spell damage to the group. It's great. Next is Warrior because they have great cooldowns, great group utility, and pretty solid active mitigation. Monks are next to last because even though they have great active mitigation tools and some nice utility, their lack of self-healing and defensive cooldowns makes them way more reliant on their healers than other tanks, and that's a big liability in dungeons. And last up is Druids. Their active mitigation is fantastic, but their self-healing is crappy, and unlike Warrior and Monk, they don't provide any kind of group DPS increase, or great AoE CC, or much at all other than a battle res, which you can get from 4 classes. They are good tanks, and they're probably the easiest for healers to keep alive, but they just don't bring a lot to the table in Mythic dungeons. Alright, now onto the raid rankings, so let's get ready to basically flip this thing on its head. First up, it's Druids. They aren't quite the best tanks at taking an enormous hit from a boss and still going. That's Brewmaster, but they are extremely good at surviving burst damage. They consistently mitigate tons of damage, and they're extremely hard to kill. Couple that with all that new DPS utility they added to tank classes, probably being provided by some DPS spec monks, warriors, and DHs, and druids don't really need to bring anything to the table other than being hard to kill. Is it boring? A little, but taking progression raids is scary, especially early in an expansion. Making that even a little bit easier is always a good thing, and druids are probably the single best class at doing that. At number 2, it's Brewmaster Monk. I struggled with not putting them at the top given how incredible Stagger and Celestial Fortune are, but in the 3 expansions monks have been a class, Brewmasters have been extremely weak at the very beginning of every expansion. The good news is that Brewmasters look stronger right now than they ever have at an expansion launch. They will be great raid tanks in BFA, but probably not quite as reliable defensively as Druids at the very beginning. At third, it's Death Knights. DKs have been the most popular raid tank for most of Legion, and that probably won't change for BFA, but frankly, most of what makes them amazing in Mythic Dungeons really doesn't translate that well to raids. They take way more damage than anyone other than Brewmasters, and unlike Brewmasters, they have extremely spiky health pools. Their self-healing is still great, but their active mitigation has lost a lot of value, and the redesign to block has given Warrior and Paladin a chance to overtake them at times. The reason I put DK ahead of the block tanks is versatility. For damage that can be blocked, DK is a little worse, but for the damage that can't be blocked, DK is a lot better. I like to think that being pretty good all of the time is better than being very good 75% of the time and not good at all 25% of the time. At number 4, I'm going with Warrior. Warrior and DK are basically at opposite ends of the spectrum. Where DK has great self-healing and terrible active mitigation, Warrior has great active mitigation and terrible self-healing. But the end result is kinda similar in raids, they're both good tanks. The redesign to block has helped Warriors out a lot, and made them the absolute best tank at mitigating physical damage. I may never get comfortable or okay with Ignore Pain and Demo Shout being on the GCD, but Warriors are still working well in spite of it. Next up is Pally, and I struggled in comparing them and Warrior quite a bit. For one, they're both block tanks, which means that they excel and struggle in the same situations. Pally has a more versatile utility toolkit and way better emergency self-healing than Warrior, but they just aren't as good at pure damage mitigation or surviving burst damage, and their defensive cooldowns aren't quite as strong. The margin between Pally, Warrior, and DK is pretty slim. And finally, in last place, it's Demon Hunters. Their self-healing and active mitigation is decent, but they really don't have the right kind of self-healing tools or defensive cooldowns to compensate for their base active mitigation being unreliable. They've certainly been the most surprisingly fun tank to play in BFA in the pre-patch for me, but I just feel like they're missing that one special thing, and I'm not exactly sure what it is. I hope they get it because I really enjoy my Demon Hunter, and I want it to be really competitive. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions or comments, or you disagree, we'll be checking the comments section like crazy, so get in there. We're super excited for the BFA release, and we can't wait to start leveling and gearing up. We will be making videos for the new expansion, so stay tuned, and as always, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.